are the basic aims of this group that appeal to you so much that you're willing to give your time and your talent to them?
I think the aims that interest me are, first of all, making known to the world at large that there are prisoners of conscience, non-violent prisoners of conscience, imprisoned all over the world, and efforts are being made to make their cause known and to secure their release, and also make it known to the world that torture is being used constantly as an instrument of policy, and that actually we ourselves are at risk unless we're aware of the fact that these things are going on in distant countries. It's a growth industry. It's becoming larger, it's becoming more extensive.
When you say a growth, do you mean imprisonment for belief, or torture itself is the growth?
Imprisonment for belief is extending, and the use of torture as an accepted instrument of persuasion and fear is in fact becoming a standard instrument now.
Are you sure that it is increasing, or is it just that organizations like Amnesty International bring this information to, we hope, the international public's ear and eye?
Well, it's obviously being made more noticeable by organizations like Amnesty, but it's also equally obvious that it's actually extending and becoming much more widely used. And for some reason it's becoming more acceptable. And each country that falls victim to it, it becomes more and more acceptable. And the risks are that it will become simply part of the policy of all countries, and we're all at risk from it.
You mean the sort of numbing effect of well, this is the kind of thing that happens, we must accept it because it's part of the way...
It's a numbing effect. It is also because there is a rhetoric which says that it's necessary, essential, and that it actually performs some social function, that it prevents terror and it prevents subversion. And the fact is that once you allow it as a technique, it starts to mortify the body politic. It starts to create an appalling atmosphere, and in the end it causes a falling apart of social structure and of personality.
Coca, it was, what, 4 years ago that you were arrested in Chile?
No, less. I was arrested in the late months of 1973, and I spent in prison 14 months. That means 1 year and 2 months.
What were the alleged charges against you?
Well, when I was arrested, they didn't say. I waited for more than a year to know why I was arrested. At the end, I was brought into trial, and my charges was that I had broken the arms law, the law against weapons. That's what they said.
Had you?
Of course not. I was found not guilty at the end, and I was released.
How old were you when you were arrested?
I was 30. Old, you say?
Yes.
30 years old.
Now, during your 14 months in prison,
yes,
were you tortured?
Yes, I was tortured. I was taken to a barrack. The night I was taken, blindfolded. They took all my clothes off. They put electricity all over my body, mainly in my head. That's why I became deaf of my left ear. But that happened to me, it's a routine. I'm just one of the hundreds of thousands of people in my country that had suffered the same torture. Some of them have died, many of them have died. I'm the lucky one of the lucky ones that are alive.
You feel you're, of course, one of the lucky ones.
Oh yes, I am.
Did you know during that terrible time that you had been adopted by Amnesty?
I didn't know. I knew only when I arrived here. But at the beginning, my prosecutor wanted 15 years in prison for me.
15?
15 years. It sounds amazing, but it was like that. And after 1 and 2 months here, I was released. And that was mainly because of international pressure, because of the campaign that Amnesty have done. And my father was told during my imprisonment that I had become an embarrassment for them. So I think that was the reason why I was released at the end.
You mean that when you say an embarrassment, that the public pressure that Amnesty was bringing to bear was embarrassing the military junta in Chile?
Of course. The public opinion all around the world, solidarity, plays a very, very and vital role. It makes them not to do whatever they want to do. If I'm here, it's because of that. But there are many that are still there, and they need that solidarity. There are more than 2,500 disappeared people, and they need all the help of the world.
2,500, this is in Chile?
In Chile
alone.
only. Imagine all over the world.
Thinking of those 2,500 in your own country, thinking of your own experience, Coca, what was the worst thing? Was it having to bear the physical torture?
No, having been in jail and having passed torture, all that is terrible. But what is most terrible is to be free, is to be safe, and to try to make people understand that freedom doesn't come from heaven. Freedom is something you must fight for it, and it's not a gift. And my country and many countries are fighting for their freedom and struggling to become free. And here I am, safe, and there are so many that need so much help.
Well, let me turn to the director of Amnesty International, David Simpson. Coca mentioned 2,500.
No, 2,500.
2,500 political prisoners, she believes, in Chile alone. How successful can an organization like yours be internationally? How many political prisoners, prisoners of conscience, are there throughout the world?
In answer to the first question, I mean, relating to Chile, the 2,500 are people, Coca was saying, have disappeared. Because although Chile says, in fact, she's released the many thousands of prisoners that she had, you see, a year ago there were about 5,000. In fact, Chile still has a lot of prisoners. It still has many hundreds, probably around 1,000. The 2,500 have completely disappeared. Amnesty's published a list, in fact, of over 1,500 of them, ones we know quite enough about to be satisfied they've disappeared. And for them, the only hope is continuing pressure, so that the Chileans say, look, the truth is they're dead, or the truth is we've got them in this or that place and we've kept them secret.
Well, let's speak internationally.
Let's talk
Are we in the millions or in the thousands?
In Amnesty's estimate, there are something like 500,000 prisoners of conscience. Prisoners of conscience, that's non-violent political prisoners, to use a sort of shorthand, throughout the world, if only we knew about them. We do know enough about 4,000 of those prisoners of conscience, people like Coca, now gladly with us, who are in countries, I should think, numbering about 60 or 70 countries we've got adopted prisoners in at the moment.
And how successful are you?
Success is a thing we shy away from claiming. All we can say is of the 4,000 we have that we're working for individually at any one time, something like 1,500, 1,600, 1,700 a year are released. Now, it would be silly to say that's all our work. Of course, sometimes it's nothing to do with us, or almost nothing. At other times, it's clearly very closely connected with the work and the campaigns that we mount. So the answer is it's somewhere in between.
I think it's very important to stress, as you've stressed the nature of the crimes that your prisoners of conscience are accused of having committed are not violent crimes, that you are not a political organization, are you?
No, we're not. Not only are we not political, we don't toe any political line, but nor do we toe any religious or moral or ethical line. We are, I suppose, loosely a humanitarian organization, but basically we only ask that countries observe very basic international standards. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, is, I suppose, the cornerstone of our organisation. Our statute, which governs our work, sets it out. We make very strong efforts not to be influenced by anybody. We don't accept government monies, for example, from any government around the world. We make sure that our work is always balanced. For example, each of the 1,600 Amnesty groups around the world, 150 of them in Britain, work for 3 prisoners, one from a left-wing country, one
Could
from a
you
right-wing
explain
one.
this, this system of
Well,
adopting in threes?
Yes,
It's most peculiar
once
to
the
me.
prisoners like Coca have been found out about, we actually pass the details out to one of the local groups. These are ordinary men and women, boys and girls, all around the world. Themselves very different politically. It's fascinating to see them meet every so often, once a year, our big annual meeting, just how diverse the people are who make up Amnesty. I get a great kick out of it. Now, these people work for 3 prisoners. They actually get a case sheet from 3 different countries, and they work by means of publicity, letter writing, telegrams. You can imagine the sort of campaigns they mount.
No, but
And
these 3 different countries represent
the
what?
3s are an effort to make, at every level, it's easy for me, but even at the local group, the grassroots level, the group that's working for prisoners, to make them have a balance in their work. So they'll work for perhaps somebody like Coca in Chile or in Argentina, somebody like Chornoville in the Soviet Union, so you've got a sort of right wing and a left wing, and somebody from a non-aligned country, or what's broadly non-aligned. Somebody like Martin Shikuku in Kenya, for example, would fall into that category. Geographical and political
So
balance.
there must always be this threesome. But
Yes.
doesn't that almost lead to a waiting list? I mean,
Well, of course,
it would be awful to say, well, I know there are 3,200 imprisoned in my country, but I have to wait until somebody in Europe or America gets imprisoned before
Yes.
they'll put me on the
That's
list?
one rule, but in addition to that, of course, Amnesty groups, Amnesty national offices like the one I run here in Britain are doing other work in some countries where, in fact, it would be dangerous to single out an individual prisoner, and a very good current example, of course, is Uganda.
Yes.
Now, some groups that haven't got prisoners in Uganda, because we don't adopt people individually there, it would be like issuing a death warrant, I should think, will be taking part in a Uganda campaign shortly, and so will I, very much, from my office. So, you know, there's additional work. The principle of 3s, as we call it in our groups, is just one effort we make to keep a balance.
Well, you mentioned Uganda. You've been involved with Amnesty for some time, Jonathan. Don't you feel that the more oppressive the regime, the less hope there is of getting any information, that it's almost useless to go into where you're most needed?
Well, I think it's
Does that worry you?
it's very hard with a very irrational regime like Uganda, where the response is unpredictable, and you've got someone who really, you can't calculate his actions in advance. One's always surprised, really, to find how embarrassable these regimes are. Regimes which you imagine are monolithic and impermeable. Something upsets their sensitivity, something embarrasses them. You can actually make them look idiots, fools, or monsters. And they are rather surprisingly sensitive to world opinion, and something one does, often quite unexpectedly, can make them suddenly crack and release prisoners. So one simply has to pursue the thing on as broad a front as possible, hoping that, after all, one is dealing with something which is a dangerous tendency in the modern world. And this plural approach, which attacks monolithic institutions, is often very successful.
Are you ever accused of interfering, though, with the government's sovereignty?
Oh, frequently. I mean, this is the most commonly laid charge against us, I should think, and we are, as a body which has what's called consultative status within the United Nations, we can produce our documents there and get them looked at and given a good airing. But of course, United Nations members are furious with us. They think this is, meddling in other people's affairs. And I think an interesting trend at the moment is the tendency of Western governments, led obviously by President Carter and now followed by David Owen, our new foreign minister, to say we will take a stand on international human rights. And in Britain, this is certainly a departure from the situation even just a year ago, where our Foreign Office said, well, we don't interfere in human rights in other countries unless one of our own citizens involved. This is a very welcome departure.
Well, the very fact that you have to exist is a great criticism of organizations like perhaps the International Red Cross, certainly of United Nations itself. What's it for?
Well, I think it's perhaps the failure on their part to realize that there are certain priorities which override questions of national sovereignty, that in the end humanitarianism and the observance of human rights is an indivisible issue. You can't think in terms of national sovereignty. If an abuse of that order is being inflicted on someone, it doesn't matter what country he is, something is being done against humanity, and one simply has to stand up and shriek.
You've stressed the fact that it's ordinary people throughout the world who make Amnesty International.
Well, Jonathan's not ordinary, of course. That's going but yes,
Non-political
we are a body
in
of
one sense.
100,000 people, most of them ordinary citizens of ordinary countries, very different politics, different religions, no religions, and really they only have one thing in common, and that is, to put it in a slightly sort of trendy way, they want everybody to have the same freedom that they have and enjoy themselves.
But sometimes it's the very ordinariness of one's life that makes it difficult to accept the fact that such things as torture exists, the feeling it could never happen here anyway.
Well, that's why it's that very ordinariness which has got to be pierced, and this is why an organisation like Amnesty is so important, in that it actually makes people aware that the devil is around all the time waiting to be released. You can staff a secret police in any country at any time, and any nation, any country which believes that it is somehow immune to this is living in a fool's paradise. In any moment, watching this programme, there are people who would, under the circumstances, inflict all the injuries which we hear about. It's possible anywhere, and we're living always on a powder keg.
I see Coca nodding.
Yes, of
Most
course.
violently, yeah.
We used to live in a democratic country, and we never thought that something of this kind would ever happen to us. And here we are.
Well, I think that our time is almost up, and so on that thought of it can happen here, and let's hope that Amnesty will make sure that throughout the world, that if it does happen in other countries, those prisoners of conscience will be, we hope, saved.